So the next question is, why are you so worried about this? And I've been thinking about how to explain this. And I think there are basically 4 reasons that as of 2 weeks ago, I became concerned. And again, I'm a little bit ashamed to admit that for the 6 weeks prior to this, I wasn't that concerned. And then what tipped? The first is I looked at some data that I had previously not paid attention to, which was the lethality versus the rate of spread. Now, I did a very crude drawing this morning to try to represent this. So if you look at this graph, on the x-axis, you have lethality. And as its name suggests, the further you go over here, the worse a disease is, the more likely you are to die if you get it. I think everybody kind of gets that concept. On the y-axis, you have something called the rate of spread, effectively, or the R naught. So you think of that as the bigger that number is, the more people a given infected person can go on to infect. So if the R naught, as it's called, is 1, each infected person, on average, will go on to infect 1 other person. If the R naught is 10, each infected person will on average go on to infect 10 people. So you can understand pretty quickly that the worst place you want is a virus that's up here. And if you look at the 3 viruses that have the highest combination of spread and lethality, it's smallpox, measles, and polio. And the good news is we have vaccines for all of those. But of course, if you understand the history of smallpox, polio, and measles, you'll understand that prior to the advent of vaccines, those were devastating conditions. Let's put this in the context of other viruses that we're more familiar with. Chickenpox. Chickenpox is a really infectious thing. Any parent who has a kid knows that when one kid gets chickenpox, they all get chickenpox. And of course, now that we have a vaccine, it's a much more mild form of the illness. But certainly for those of us who were old, when we were kids, that was the case. But it's not very lethal, right? So it's sort of just up here. You're going to get it. Once you get it, like everyone's going to get it, but it doesn't really harm you that much. At the other end of the spectrum, you have something like Ebola, and everybody's really afraid. We all remember the panic around Ebola, but I think what we're missing in that is Ebola was not a very easy to spread virus. So devastating virus, obviously very lethal, but it didn't really spread. To get it from an infected person, you had to really be in very close contact with them. When you consider something like H1N1, which was, I think, probably the most recent flu that sort of generated a lot of the attention, you know, it had a relatively low rate of spread and a relatively low lethality. And you can see I've sort of drawn a few other things on here. The point I really want to make is the following. The SARS-CoV-2, or the virus that is the coronavirus responsible for COVID-19, we're still not exactly sure where it sits, but we know it sits about here. And that's a pretty bad place to be. Why? Because it's quite lethal. It's about 10 times more lethal than H1N1 or a standard influenza, to be more specific. Maybe not, and hopefully not as lethal as the 1918 Spanish flu, but it's also much more infective. And again, the estimates are all over the place. So I think the WHO estimate right now for the R naught is about 2.25 to 3.35, or it's called about 3.25. By comparison, the standard seasonal influenza is about 1.3. We've interviewed people who believe that the R naught is as high as 5. Now, the good news is the better we get at understanding this disease, the more we can drive it down here. And that's your goal, right? Your goal is to reduce lethality and spread into this corner. But the point is, at this moment in time, that's where it's sitting. All of that is the first thing that concerns me. The second thing that concerns me is the rate of growth. And I would encourage you, if you're a numbers person, to pay attention to this metric. If you go and look at the number of new cases each day, and you divide that by the previous day's new cases, you will get an estimate of the growth rate. Now, if anybody remembers from calculus, calculus is the mathematics that describes growth rates. We talk about these things as being concave up or concave down. In fact, I should have drawn a picture for this. I will do it now. A curve is concave up when it looks like this. So concave up means not only is the growth happening, meaning, this is also growth and this is also growth. So all of these have a positive first derivative, meaning they're all getting bigger. The difference is the rate at which this is getting bigger is also getting bigger. The rate at which this is getting bigger is unchanged, and the rate at which this is getting bigger is slowing. Those are three different types of curves. Needless to say, the one you're most afraid of is this one. And lo and behold, that's where we are right now in the United States. Now, again, there's good news here. The good news is in China, we were there until, I believe, about February 12th or February 13th. That's when China flipped from being in this pattern of growth to this pattern of growth. So to be clear, there are still cases growing in China. We have more cases today than we did yesterday, but the rate at which that's happening is flattening. And we haven't yet hit that in the United States. And that, to me, is a concern locally. Now, I don't want to get too far down the weeds on this. There are people much smarter than me who have put out amazing content that you can study. We're doing our own internal analysis on this just to sort of check it with what other people are doing. But the point is the rate of change of growth is positive. And frankly, it's going to be hard for me to sleep thinking that this is come and gone until that rate of change actually becomes negative, meaning the second derivative is negative. We call that downward concavity or concave down. Okay, what's the third thing that concerns me about this? I kind of alluded to this in question 2, which is the mechanism of action is way harder to predict. There seems to be something a little more stochastic and a little difficult to understand about why two otherwise healthy 40-year-olds can have a completely different disease course. One of them can go on to have a mild, self-limited 2-week thing that frankly is less severe than influenza and just looks like a RSV or an echovirus or some garden variety scummy virus. And another person can end up in an ICU and potentially dead. The fourth thing that has me concerned is the insult that this can have on the healthcare system. And there's really two prongs to that. The first is if you look at the analyses of per capita individuals to per capita beds, we don't have a lot of headroom, right? We don't have a lot of room to go from here's the healthcare system, here's the maximum capacity at which we can take care of people. And again, you don't have to look much further than Italy to understand what happens when a healthcare system gets overrun. But the second issue, and this is an issue that is getting a lot of attention now, but I think up until a couple of weeks ago wasn't, was the impact this has on the healthcare providers, the doctors, the nurses, the respiratory therapists who take care of patients. When you put that group of people in contact with people who are so infectious, it becomes another nonlinear problem, which is the people who are taking care of the sick, once they start to get sick, even at 10% of that population who are at such high risk, all of a sudden your ability to deliver care goes down. So in summary, those are the four things that have me a little worried about this, and frankly, a lot more worried than I would be about a seasonal flu.